Welcome to the Unleashing Your Powerhouse podcast with Charlene Tarver. Unleashing is all about living into the best and greatest version of yourself. Real truth from and for real people. Edgy, entertaining, and sometimes bougie. Join us for real discussions on everything from dating and sex to entrepreneurship and getting the bag. It's sure to be fun and thought-provoking as we welcome subject matter experts, industry leaders, and my best girlfriends to discuss things you want to know on your journey to unleashing. Join me, your host, Charlene Tarver, for the Unleashing podcast. To Unleashing Your Powerhouse. Thanks for joining us for Women's History Month here at Unleashing Your Powerhouse. I'm your host, Charlene Tarver, and I am so excited that you've joined us for this week's segment on mental health and trauma. Mental health is such an important part of all of our lives, especially for women, mothers, women entrepreneurs, women of color. So we did not want March to exit without discussing Black women navigating trauma. This week on Unleashing, we are excited to be joined by Angel Stanley. Angel is a nurse practitioner with extensive experience in trauma services. So we are so excited to have her with us. This month, we also have segments on everything from navigating trauma and domestic violence to colorism and women's empowerment. So please check out some of our other segments. But for tonight, I am excited to welcome Angel Stanley. Angel, thank you so much for joining us. Can you please tell our audience a little about yourself and your practice?
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Charlene. My practice is Angel S. Stanley, nurse practitioner in psychiatry. And again, like you said, my specialty is in trauma and the stress response. So, one of the major things that I do is I help clients to identify what trauma is, how trauma affects them physiologically, emotionally, spiritually, and to come up with treatment plans and modalities and ways in which to help them heal and recover from the trauma that they've either experienced as a child or through their growing development in adulthood.
Wow. So you have a huge plate because you are looking at how folks manifest trauma, where that trauma originates from, and then how they can actually create different modalities to address and manage that trauma. So we're talking to the right person. So again, Angel, thank you so much for joining us for this segment this week. How did you end up working in the trauma industry or working with trauma patients? Tell us a little bit about your background and kind of your own personal trajectory.
Well, I think trauma kind of it found me, I guess. I think a lot of times when you experience something personally and intimately, it then becomes your calling, right? So I grew up in a household of domestic violence, and so I was raised in a home where I experienced domestic violence on a routine and a regular basis. I also grew up in the inner city in what we like to call the hood, the ghetto, whatever you want to call it, however you want to express it. But either way, I was exposed to a lot of environmental hostilities and environmental trauma and a lot of oppression and a lot of sadness and just a lot of emotional and mental health that I saw within my own personal community. And so growing up in that experience, because we often look at, is it nature, is it nurture, is it the biology, of the person, or is it the environment of the specimen? And so we kind of realize that it's actually a combination of the two. It's the environment as well as the genetic makeup. And that's where we get a lot of our generational traumas from. And so it kind of found me in the sense in that I always had a wondering of why are some people a little bit more resilient when we've all been experienced the same or similar circumstances, but you have some people who can bounce back from traumas a lot better than others.
Mm.
And you have some people who get stuck and trapped in their traumas and it becomes a lifelong illness. And so that is kind of how I started to research the effects of psychological, psychosocial, physiological, and emotional effects of trauma on the human person and on the development. So, what I've come to learn and realize is that it's a lifelong process. We really experience it early on in our childhood, and then it evolves and develops over time, and it expresses itself in a number of different ways.
Wow. So you have, based upon what you just said, what I understand is you can have two children who grow up in the same inner city community, both exposed to poverty, both exposed to domestic violence, oppression, socioeconomic issues and challenges. And those two children or two individuals can have completely different responses to
Yes.
that trauma. That is so fascinating. So you're saying that this is as much about the genetic makeup of a person as it is how that person is actually nurtured. So it's as much about their nature as it is the way they're nurtured. That is so fascinating. Tell us, who are your patients or your clients? Are your clients children? Are they women? Are they families? Who are your clients that you work with largely?
A combination of all of the above. I actually work with human development over the lifespan. So I work with patients from the ages of 3 to what we call 99 or so to the older adult. So I work with all individuals, male, female, as well as transgender, gender transitioning, which I have a lot of clients that I work with in that arena as well. But I work with all ages. And I think trauma isn't subjective to one specific socioeconomic class group and or culture or ethnicity. So I work with patients and people of all walks of life and all ethnicities.
Okay. So, we're talking about trauma. We're talking about folks growing up in environments because we know that zip codes typically will dictate, a zip code will dictate the quality of a person's life, right? And so
Yes.
kids who grow up in inner city communities and some of the poorest communities, poorest zip codes, more likely than not, they're going to kind of stay or are entrapped in a life that is a lesser quality, unfortunately. When we look at trauma, and I know a lot of times as Black women, we'll talk about generational curses, right?
Yes.
And so is generational curse and trauma, is that the same? Is that our code word for trauma? Is it the same thing?
I want to say it is the same thing, right? Because what it really is an imprint on the soul or an imprint on the DNA that then reacts or responds over time. It's the same thing where you have where skips one generation to the other, but it's
Mhm.
still imprinted on our DNA, on our coding, on our codon. And so it expresses itself in different ways. So it is a continuation. It's almost like the oppression that Black communities, oppressed communities have experienced through slavery and other forms of oppression. It is imprinted in the DNA and it expresses itself in different ways throughout multiple generations. And we know that even though we look at slavery as being 65, 100 years old, we see the repercussions of it in our modern day society in a number of different ways. And a lot of it has to do with illness. So, why do African Americans have higher levels of heart disease, higher levels of emotional and mental disease or conflicts? And why do they often have lower quality of life? more breast cancer. Why are all these different things a part of our particular life story when it's not that of others? And that goes into where my graduate research is. It's on trauma and the stress response, because one of the things about trauma is it creates a cascade of stressors, and those stressors create different forms of hormone, and that hormone creates different type of physiological responses within the body that make African Americans more susceptible to heart disease and diabetes and emotional and mental illness.
Okay, so we're going to come back to that because you packed so much into that, and I really want us to spend a little time unpacking it. But just going back again for clarification around trauma, because I think a lot of times when we hear the word trauma, many of us, we don't think that applies to us. So we believe when we hear trauma services that they're talking about someone else. When you think of things like bipolar, ADHD, is that considered trauma, or are those, because they are a clinical diagnosis, are those different from trauma? And is trauma a clinical diagnosis?
Trauma is not a clinical diagnosis.
Okay.
Trauma is the response that creates the diagnosis. So when we look at depression, for one, depression is usually created, or the propensity for depression is usually established by the time a child is 1 years old. So it goes
Wait,
in
wait, 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 wait. You said say that again. The diagnosis for depression is
the
created in one.
conditioning,
The
the
condition.
physiological conditioning of depression is already established by the time a child is 1 years old. Schizophrenia is goes in bipolar disorder goes back to 2 years old. So there's a certain criteria of conditioning that makes one more susceptible to developing depression, anxiety, bipolar, or schizophrenia over time.
So, what are some of the criteria that you're seeing that kind of help us to know that this child, at one, that this child has a predisposition for depression? Like, what are some of the criteria you see?
Early childhood neglect,
Okay.
malnutrition, failure to thrive. So when a family, I was going to say a woman, but men are included as well, when a family has a child, when that child isn't picked up when they cry, fed when they're hungry, changed when they're wet, made warm when they're cold, soothed when they're uncomfortable, it creates a pathological, physiological response within the body of a stress or a stressor.
Okay.
And then the physiological response to that creates within that child, is this world a safe place where my needs are being met? Or is this world an unsafe place where I don't know when the next time I cry, if someone's going to answer that cry? Or the next time I'm wet, is someone going to change me? Or when I'm hungry, am I going to get fed? So we see that in a patterning of early neglect when the child isn't being nurtured and cared for in the appropriate ways, in the way in which they need to, they develop this physiological response to the neglect that predispositions them to developing depression and anxiety, PTSD, ADHD. ADHD is a big maladaptive stress response.
During COVID-19, during the pandemic, we saw a spike in the number of children that were diagnosed with depression. We also saw a spike in teen suicides, right? So, clearly that's kind of coinciding with everything that you're sharing, which is when children are in environments as early and as young as one and earlier, where they're not nurtured, they're not loved, they're not cared for, communicated with, touched. Right? Because there have also been studies where children who were left and they weren't physically touched compared to children who were physically touched and held and cuddled, that those children tended to have, greater degrees they had greater challenges with thriving, with growth, when they didn't have that physical touch. So that is all so very fascinating. You talked a little bit about, kind of hypertension, heart disease, high blood pressure. These are all issues that we're seeing much more commonly with Black women. I think I want to say 50 to 75% of Black women above the age of 25, I want to say, and don't quote me on that, but it's somewhere around that 25 to 30, have actually have high blood pressure, right? So high blood pressure and heart disease have become so synonymous with Black women's health, right? In the Black female experience. So when you talk about kind of, some of the hormonal issues, you talk about kind of the physiological manifestation of trauma. Are there certain things that are happening specifically with Black women that are increasing their heart disease and hypertension and their production of these hormones? And I think you're talking about cortisol, but talk a little bit more about the hormone production and what specifically is happening with Black women that we're seeing these high rates of heart disease and hypertension and high blood pressure.
So to start off, we're looking at environment, right? We know that the urban and the inner city is oftentimes populated in areas around the country where there are high levels of pollution. So we have more pollution in the air, we have more pollution in the water, like the lead crisis that we have in our own current community. And so therefore we have those toxins that are in the environment with predisposition to have abnormal or hormonal abnormalities. Then you have the stress. A lot of times there's single family households. There's high levels of poverty, higher levels of oppression, not enough food supply in the urban cities and in areas where we need to have more fresh fruits, more fresh vegetables. There's a lot more experience around environmental hostilities with drugs and gang violence and gun violence and a lot of domestic violence. And so, therefore, the higher the stress level is, the more out of balance the hormones are because one is living in a constant state of stress. And so oftentimes we don't think about, I always use this analogy of the movie, what was the movie? I can't think of the movie right offhand, but when you have that environment where there's helicopters, um, Boys in the Hood, you had that scene where you had helicopters in the air, gunshots going off in the background. You have all of these environmental triggers that create a stress response. So every time you hear a helicopter go off, you're constantly worried, is that my child? Is my child coming home safe? Is it something when you hear an ambulance go down the street, especially when you've lost a loved one to environmental hostilities or some form of violence? You're automatically on edge all the time. When you send your children outside to play, you hear gunshots going off or arguments going on outside. You're immediately on edge. Is that something to do with your child or your family member? Because post traumatic stress disorder is also related to hearing of, finding out about a loved one who was also passed away or had an injury due to violence or an accident. It doesn't necessarily have to be within the person. You can hear about someone getting in a car accident, hear about someone dying from gunshots or a fight or anything like that. That creates that stress response. And just the reaction of hearing it sends the stress response into a heightened sense. And so then, therefore, every time you get that same experience or you see that same experience, it triggers you again. And also within the DNA. So we have that long-term patterning of being in an environment where there's a lot of single family households. So we grow up in single family households. We have children that we need to care for ourselves. And we already know that proper development is related to a family. It takes a man, a woman, and the village to appropriately raise and upbring civilization, like it was in times past where we had a community of support. Now, when we look at that same analogy in certain communities where families have three and four generations in a home, they have lower stress levels. The children are better cared for. They're more well nurtured. They don't have the same stress response that a lot of African American women have with the single family household, limited social supports, not having father figures in the home, limited amount of resources. So you're always wondering, how am I going to pay this bill? How am I going to put food on the table? What about the fact that you have to walk to the grocery store and carry your groceries back, right? Because you don't have transportation. Maybe you don't even have money to catch the bus. You have to save what it is that you have to get to work that next day. And so there's all of these compounding stressors. And it's already difficult enough to raise kids. Children don't come with a rule book. They don't come with
Mhm.
instructions. So if you don't have the best upbringing and the best examples of how to raise children appropriately, then you're struggling right out of the bat with learning how to cope with life on life's terms and rear and raise children appropriately. And these stressors just begin to compound and compound. And then when you throw in toxic relationships, domestic violence, illness, sickness, all of these other things that can then become a part of the human experience that compound the stress response. Black women have more stressors than a lot of other ethnic groups, and therefore they have more physiological health disease related to those stressors.
Okay. Hmm. So you talked about PTSD. And I
Mhm.
want to go back to PTSD for a moment. You know, many of us, we think of PTSD and we think of the military. So we think of folks who've actually been in active service, and we associate that with being a condition of active service, right? Or folks who have retired from active service or been, discharged from active service. PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, what I'm hearing from you is that it is also can also be synonymous with being in hostile, impoverished, oppressive environments. In fact, I was actually diagnosed with PTSD. So I was diagnosed with PTSD following an automobile accident I had where I sustained a blow to the head. I was diagnosed with PTSD and with anxiety. So when you talk about PTSD, there are a number of different things that can trigger PTSD. And PTSD is kind of where you have I think it's a baseline stress level, the way that your body naturally manages stress. And if something happens, it can knock off that baseline, right? And, well, I don't want to get into explaining it because you're the expert. So do you want to tell us a little bit about PTSD, about kind of how PTSD works?
So when we look at PTSD, it's all about the stress response, right? It's a survival mechanism. It's that fight or flight response that we have. What usually happens is you have some form of negative consequence. Could be a car accident. It could be a slip and fall,
Could you see someone being killed in front of you? Yeah.
seeing someone being
Hmm.
killed, hearing of someone being killed,
It could be
right?
domestic violence, right? Your own
Domestic
personal
violence.
physical abuse. Hmm.
Yes, that's a big one. And then what ends up happening is you have this state of helplessness where you feel as if though you don't have control, there's nothing that you can do to protect yourself. So the survival mechanism is compromised. And once that survival mechanism is compromised because of either a near death experience, hearing about a death experience, or just experiencing something that's extremely traumatic, the body goes into a state of shock. And what often happens is you don't fully recover from that state of shock. And so therefore, every time that state of shock is re-triggered, either by a thought, could be a smell, it could be something you see, something you hear, or even a flashback of what you experienced, what you heard, or what happened. It re-triggers that cascade all over again. And so what ends up happening is the respirations become shallow, the muscles become tense, the heart begins to beat fast, you begin to feel anxious and fearful, and you either do one or two things. You either lash out in anger and you're ready to fight and protect yourself, or you retreat and you cower and you're afraid and you become more dependent, you have a state of helplessness, or you either become very angry and you lash out and you respond and react to every little thing. It could be the littlest thing. Somebody stepped on your shoe or stepped on your toe accidentally. And it's like, you immediately get enraged because that sense of safety has been compromised in a past trauma, but then it's reactivated. It can be reactivated by the simplest thing.
So you have this consistent, continual triggering that's happening that if you do not get treatment, right, then that triggering can continue for the rest of your life. And in addition to everything you've described, your body is also producing cortisol, right,
Yeah.
which is that's a stress hormone.
It's meant to help to relieve the stress. So
Okay.
it's meant to help to come in and soothe the body. But on top of the cortisol, what it's trying to counteract is all of the dopamine and the
And
adrenaline and the
adrenaline.
other hormones that are being reacted to help you to preserve yourself, to protect yourself. And so the cortisol comes in to try to soothe, but then what ends up happening when you have over cortisol production, it begins to create health problems like the heart disease, like diabetes. And a lot of people don't realize it's also other organs that are affected as well. Pretty much every single system of the body is triggered by stress. The cardiac system, that's where people get enlarged heart from. When you have a lot of resentment, you often build up a lot of acid in the body. So, therefore, you have a lot of rheumatology or endocrinology disorders that can lead to arthritis, bone and joint pain. Anxiety and stress could lead
Mhm.
to things like irritable bowel. Lots of trauma, especially sexual trauma. Sexual trauma will lead to things like fibromyalgia and what people will often think of as like phantom pain. For anyone who's ever lost a limb, they can still feel a toe itching and the toe isn't even there anymore. But they still have that phantom response of that toe itching, right? We call it phantom pain or phantom sensations. It's the exact same thing with trauma. When you have that trauma and that triggering response, what often happens is you now have a phantom analogy of it that continues to establish and create, which causes problems in the body. So you have pain in the body that the doctors can't identify where it comes from. And a lot of it comes from inflammation because what's happening when all of that cortisol is flooding the system is it's creating an inflammatory response. That inflammatory response causes congestion, and congestion in the system decreases circulation, and that decreased circulation causes the problems within the nerve cells of the tissues, which could be the muscles and the joints, lots of migraines, headaches. So there's a lot of things that is affected by the stress response.
Wow. And so much of our chronic illnesses like cancer
Mhm.
really kind of develop and are cultivated in inflammatory environments. So where you see inflammation. So it is so fascinating how all of these, how much stress impacts the quality of our lives, the quality of our neurological experience and our psychological and physiological experiences. So you are truly educating me here, Angel. You're educating me, and I think for all of our listeners, again today we are here with Angel Stanley. Angel is a nurse practitioner, and she is a trauma specialist, and so we are talking about how women kind of navigate trauma, and really, Angel has done an amazing job of helping us really understand what constitutes trauma. I want to now shift gears for a moment. When I first came back to Syracuse, so we're both here in Syracuse, New York.
Yes.
When I came back to Syracuse, May 1st will make it 4 years now that I've been back in Syracuse. And I moved here from Phoenix, Arizona. And my intent was to be bi-coastal. So I was going to come into Syracuse. We were expanding the Women's Economic Institute, and I was going to work between Syracuse and Arizona. And Arizona is probably sunny 300 and I'll say probably 350 days a year we have sun. Syracuse is probably 250 days a year that we have overcast.
Mhm.
So, Black women, Black folks, we are melanated people. And as melanated people, we thrive very heavily on vitamin D. And in this area, there is a lot of vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D is so critical to how we process nutrients and so many of our other vitamins and how the heart functions, et cetera. So I want to talk about vitamins and kind of, how much does diet, vitamins, sleep, hydration, how much do those, stress management, how much do they impact, a woman's overall mental health? Is vitamins, is that a factor or?
It's a huge factor, especially for women and hormones, estrogen, progesterone development hormones are created through the amount of vitamins that we put into our bodies, and that's why nutrition is so important. Vitamin D regulates a lot of things that we tend to not really think a lot about. Our hair growth, skin, nail growth, strength is all factors of vitamin D. Our bone density, big factor related to vitamin D. What is stored in the bone? Different nutrients that our bodies need in order to create more blood cells and to create more skin cells, hair cells, nail cells, to really create all of the responses related to our nervous system are all driven by vitamin D. So, vitamin D is very, very important in a number of different things. Also, for ovulation and for childbirth. One of the other things that vitamin D does is the motor responses in our tissues for us to be able to move appropriately,
Mhm,
to build muscle. Vitamin D regulates that as well. So, vitamin D is very important amongst lots of other nutrients. Oh, excuse me.
mhm,
Among other nutrients, but vitamin D is one of the more critical ones, and you have to get it from sun, right? We try to get it from fortified milks, but really it's something that we absorb through our skin, through sunlight. And so having a lack of sun exposure will create a vitamin D deficiency. But what does the vitamin D deficiency create within the body? It creates stagnancy. It creates muscle tension. It creates, a lot of people don't realize when they have twitches, muscle twitches, that's a factor or a side effect of low vitamin D. When you have depressed mood, sleep disturbances is a factor of vitamin D. Your sleep wake cycle being off, your menstrual cycle for women being off is a factor of your vitamin D levels as well. The other things that vitamin D also regulates within the body is it regulates things like metabolism and appetite, energy level, mood. And so there's all of these different components from just something as simple as sun that will regulate how our bodies respond to stress and also how our overall wellness and emotional wellness will be. How happy are you, right? When it's raining out, you don't feel as energized, you don't have as much motivation to do things. And so when you live in a population where it's less sunlight, a lot of times you have lower vitamin D levels and there's higher levels of depression. And that's where some people see seasonal affective patterns to their depression, where they're more depressed in the wintertime and in the fall than they are in the spring and summer.
and so that's one of the conditions. I think I experienced it here, and I think a lot of people do. It's sad, right? But it's that
Yeah.
seasonal. What is
Affective disorder.
seasonal affective disorder? It is so real. It is so real. Vitamin D is critical. Vitamin B is critical.
Yeah.
Calcium, collagen, especially for women beyond a certain age. Another thing that that came to my attention recently was potassium and how
Yes.
potassium controls the electroconnectivity in the heart. So when we're talking about mental health, how you live, what you eat, what you think, how you function, all of those things impact your overall mental health. So we want to encourage not just women, but everyone to be more intentional in how you live and make sure that you're putting yourself in the best position to really be able to have the best quality of life, because you can't unleash into your best, boldest, brightest self if you're not even healthy. So we need folks to
Yes.
be healthy. That's critically important. You know, um, Angel, you have shared so many nuggets with us today. You are just absolutely phenomenal. I am so
Yeah.
impressed with you. I want you to tell everybody how they can get in contact with you. How do they reach you?
Well, I am on Facebook. So my site page is Angel S. Stanley, nurse practitioner in psychiatry. You can reach me there. My website is the same, Angel S. Stanley. NP in psychiatry. And you can reach me on my website as well. The phone number, my phone number, if anyone who wants to contact me or get in contact with me, you can get it off of my website, but you can also reach out to me directly. And, if you ever want, I do consultations. So if anybody wants a consultation, if you have any questions around mental health, I'm always doing talks in the community, always willing to help people understand, what they're going through, if there's anything that they can do differently, if there are resources within the community that can help them with that as well. I'm trying to figure out where did I put my, I don't call myself, so I can't find my phone number, but I have it somewhere. But yeah, you can get in contact with me on Facebook. I don't really do a lot of the Twitter things and things like that. But
Okay.
my number is 315-802-3638. And also my email, Angel S. Stanley, NP in psychiatry at yahoo.com. And also visit my website because one of the best things that I have on my website is I have resources, free resources. You can go online, learn about depression, learn about bipolar disorder. I have activities, workbooks, worksheets, all types of things on there. You can leave me comments, you can ask questions, I'll get back to you. You can also ask me questions directly on Facebook and Messenger. If there's anything that you want to know about and you want to keep private, you're more than welcome to reach me there. And yeah, I love all things mental health, especially when it comes to the African American community and really decreasing the amount of stigma around asking for help because that's a part of being resilient is knowing where to get the help, knowing that you can reach out for help and being willing to accept help. And that's one of the ways in which we bounce back and be resilient and overcome mental health in our community.
Wonderful, wonderful. So for those of you who are saying we need resources, where do we go? Who do we call? Who do we talk to? Angel has just told you all of her contact information. We're going to make sure you also have that and that we're able to make that available to you in our comments and everything. So we definitely want you to reach out to Angel. Angel, you talked a little bit about some of the treatment options. I know there's a lot of stigma around therapy and counseling still, but we're trying to be more intentional in breaking down some of those stereotypes. Can you talk a little bit about other treatment options? You can talk about therapy and counseling, and maybe even is there a difference between therapy and counseling, and what are some of the other treatment modalities that folks can look into if they're dealing with trauma?
So I want to say first off, and the one that I think is the most important is having a higher power in a regular spiritual practice. I think a lot of times we overlook the importance of a spiritual practice and a higher connection to source energy, higher than oneself, rather you call it God or whatever it is that you call it, but having that attachment and having a spiritual practice that you do on a regular basis. Prayer is a wonderful tool for health, mental health, emotional health, and physiological health. There is a difference between therapy and counseling. Counseling is one of the things in which we do to help patients express themselves because a lot of times patients have a very hard time expressing what they're feeling or really understanding their emotions. And they think a lot of times it's just the me thing. I'm the only one experiencing this. I'm the only one suffering from this. And so, therefore, they isolate, they don't talk about it, they hold it all in, which we always know whenever you're holding in issues, those issues become part of your tissue. Rather, it's cancer, rather, it's another physiological disease like heart disease or diabetes or whatever it is, it begins to create disease or malfunction in the body. Therapy is a little bit different. Therapy is a specific type of treatment modality, and we have different ones. People may have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy or EMDR therapy, interpersonal therapy, radical acceptance therapy. There's lots of different types of therapy in which there are philosophers, people who have created a framework of working with people with specific types of trauma. But I want to say probably one of the most important things is having a community of support. And that's the biggest thing that I see on a regular basis when I'm counseling and working with patients is that they don't have a support system. They don't have anyone else to reach out to. So having a support system, support group, some type of group where you can go, whether it's family, friends, and or extended, because that's another thing. Sometimes we're born into families that aren't the family that we always wanted, but we create family because family are the people that are there for us when we need them. And so realizing that you can create a family unit or a social connection outside of your primary family of origin. That's another way. But one of the most important things, and I think a lot of even clinicians and practitioners don't realize, the importance of establishing a treatment plan targeted to your individual need. And that's one of the most important things. And so when you work with me as a clinician, I'm going to ask you things that you never even thought were relevant to why you continuously do the same things over and over again and expect different results. Because a lot of times we don't look at the fact that our trauma is related to why we have codependency, why we're reactive in relationships, why we have a specific type of attachment style, why our relationships never last, why we always tend to do things a certain way. Like even when it comes to things like OCD, right? OCD is a response to trauma. And you need to have everything in a certain amount of order. You need to have control of things. If you feel as if though you're losing control, then you get all anxiety and stressed out, and you can't go to bed if there's a one cup on the counter. All of these things are reactive responses to stress. And so when you're working with me, I'm going to take you all the way back to your childhood. We're going to look at every stage of your development from the time that you can remember, which most people, especially when they've had a tremendous trauma impact or scar, they can't remember things past a certain age or before a certain age in their lives. So we're going to go back as far as you can remember. And we're going to begin to chronologically identify what happened at this point in time in your life and how that scar is continuing to affect you in the now. And then we're going to look at what we need to do to help you to recover and heal from it. And we're going to look at all aspects of your life, including your health, as well as your financial wellness, right? Because if you don't have any money or you feel as if though you're always in lack, you're going to be depressed. You're going to have anxiety. I tell my patients this all the time. They say, "Well, I'm depressed." I said, "Well, if you're living under a bridge with no financial support, no social support, no family, no friends, no resources, I can give you 1,000,000 milligrams of an antidepressant. You're still going to be depressed." So, one of the things that I work with patients, I don't want to have to work with you for 15 or 20 years. And I work with a lot of patients that have been in therapy for 20 or 30 years. My goal is to identify what we need to heal. And I want to be able to provide you with the tools to heal that trauma so that you don't have to see me for the next 20 years. And that's one of the reasons why I don't primarily work with children, but I specialize in children because children are our future. And if we can address those issues now, then they won't be the 30, 40, 50, or 60-year-old that's still coming to see me because of the psychological abuse that they sustained when they were 5.
Wow. All I can say, Angel, is you you have really opened my eyes about so many things that are mental health related and how I approach my own mental health and so many things that I kind of dismiss. And I know you and I have conversations all the time. So I thank you so much for just being such a true blessing and a presence for our audience here on Unleashing. Our goal through the podcast is really to help empower specifically women and women of color to really live boldly. And
Yeah.
as I said earlier, you can't do that if you're not your healthiest self. And there are so many things that have happened in our lives that are issues that are unresolved, that we've been carrying decade after decade, generation after generation. And it sounds like you are the one of the people that folks can come to if they want to start to unpack some of the things that are holding them back, that are keeping them stagnant, that are stopping them from really living out boldly the way that they choose to, desire to, and deserve to.
Yeah.
So, thank you again so much for being with us. I truly, truly appreciate it. Before we close out, I want to go back to what you said when you first started. You talked about your own trauma, you talked about your trauma journey. And oftentimes it's very difficult to face trauma, right?
Mhm.
It's very hard if you've been a victim of domestic violence or any type of sexual assault or sexual abuse. Oftentimes you're victimized. Even go a lot of times, victims do not report the crimes because they know when they go through the criminal justice system that they're going to be even further victimized by needing to retell those stories and relive that experience. What would you say to women who are dealing with trauma? And let's say women who are dealing with domestic violence or sexual assault or some sort of abuse. What would you say to them, if you could share anything to encourage them to get help, support, and to reach out and get the resources? What would you share? What would you tell them?
I would say education is key. The more you know, the more you're able to help yourself. I think one of the most least expensive and most effective ways of doing self care is journaling. And so when you can be open and honest about your experience, oftentimes we'll keep things in. And what journaling does is it helps us to get whatever we're experiencing or feeling from the inside out. And that's a way of shedding, right? And when we're able to shed that experience, get it out. It's the first stage towards the healing and recovery process. And so the more you can get educated, the more you educate yourself, the better off that you are. But help is really key. But one of the things that we have as a society is we have trust issues, right? As I opened up before and it came back to bite me, or someone told my story or shared my experience with someone else. And so we need to create safe spaces for women to be able to open up. And until you're at that point where you're able to open up and share openly and honestly, I always say journal because you need to get it out. And even if you don't feel safe or you think that someone is going to find what it is that you wrote, write it, tear it up, throw it out. Because that's really what you want to do with it anyway. You want to get rid of it. And so that is a symbolism way of ridding yourself of whatever it is that's harming you, that's causing you internal pain, especially when it comes to domestic violence. Women oftentimes won't speak up. There's the heart that's involved, right? We love someone even though we know that person is harming us and not treating us well. We have children that we have to protect. This is our home environment. We know that finances can also be a source of control. And so money may be an issue. Not having a safe place to go may be an issue. Oftentimes, abusers will separate you from your support system. So now you feel isolated and alone. You don't have a social circle or support network that you can speak to. And so that's another aspect as well. But what we do is when you reach out, when you open up, even if it's just YouTube, is a wonderful place. And I'm not saying that you can get things off of YouTube and everything is going to be accurate, right? But there are a lot of people on YouTube, very licensed, very skilled. They have credentials, they know what they're talking about. If you're suffering from something, try to find a support group or a network that is also has information that you can use to help better yourself. And also, they can always reach out to you, Charlene Tarver, at the Women's Economic Institute. I am stationed in the Women's Economic Institute, and we're looking to open up classes and support groups and to help women in the community with domestic violence and with other issues related to trauma, related to understanding their physiological wellness, all aspects of health, and really learning how to build a healthier, more vibrant, more fulfilling quality of life, because it's really all about the quality of life, and gratitude and happiness will take you a long way. So try to live every day gratefully. And I think really, like I said, the first thing, having a higher spiritual connection and having that source of support that you can draw on when things become difficult.
Absolutely. Well, Angel, again, thank you so much for joining us. I keep saying thank you. I feel like I can't say thank you enough, for 2025 and the launching the Unleashing Your Powerhouse podcast. Our whole goal is to create a community where women are able to come and share stories and experiences. I am opening my Rolodex to some of my best girlfriends, to some of my best colleagues, to women who are out here who are bosses and leaders in a variety of different industries so that we can have real conversations because I don't believe that people can live into their best selves if they don't have the tools and the resources. And Angel said so many things today. She talked about your vitamins. She talked about the quality of your living and getting therapy and counseling and building a tribe and having that community of support. And so that is really what we are attempting to do through Unleashing Your Powerhouse, as well as through the Women's Economic Institute. So, Angel, thank you so much for mentioning the Women's Economic Institute. I want to encourage you all to stay connected. Follow up with us, subscribe, like, tell your girlfriends to come join us. Make sure you stay tuned for our weekly segments and take a moment when your schedule is clear sooner rather than later. Look up Angel S. Stanley, reach out to her, and let's start a journey this year that is intentional, that is strategic, and that will be productive and fruitful. So I encourage you, stay connected, and thank you so much for joining us for this segment of Unleashing Your Powerhouse with your host, Charlene Tarver. You all have a wonderful rest of the week.